This is my covering map, Rotation Explorer, covering map explorer. It you can have a polar graph, which this would be more like a complex number with an r and a theta. The r is actually an angle along the sphere. So the total r of the graph is what size is here. So at 180 degrees, it goes up to the next pole. The 90 degrees is the equator. The latitude of this is where the origin starts. So it's basically, where this point is. When it's at the pole, the longitude doesn't really change it very much. Because it's just, it's rotating the longitude around that. If it's exactly 0, then the graph of the rotation points for that, rotation vectors, is just a flat plane. In this orientation, it's the x and z components, and y is the direction that's up, as in most computer graphics. Z is considered forward and backward. Which I've come to realize in quantum physics is, the standard is looking at it from a z direction, which is up, which is fine. I mean, you can just reassign the axes, and it doesn't really matter. So on this xz plane, that the y is going up, for a certain angle of rotation axis, going further and further out is applying that rotation more and more. So you start at 0, which is the top, and as the radius goes out, it applies the rotation to that frame more and more. So it rotates the up direction. That basis frame initially is all oriented the same way. So you have up, and x, y, and z is RGB. So x, y, z. And then that's just rotating that around this axis. So this line would be rotating along this direction because the axis is perpendicular to the direction of rotation. And these are all I should mention all these are great circles, so they're geodesics. Even sort of these lines in between, although the distance changes, but the angle between them is constant. So in a sense, they all have the same distance angularly. So even these horizontal lines are really geodesic lines. But that's another point entirely. So starting from this base projection, these are the points of the rotation vectors. And at each point, I also draw the relative frame. So you could see, if you find the direction frame that has this x, y, and z, then you can relate this point to this point out here. And in the center, all the y normals are up, and they rotate, to 90 degrees from where they were. So the more interesting point is when you have a spin of 1/2, 1 pi. So your origin is actually the South Pole. that translates these rotation vectors from the plane to a plane that's perpendicular. So this is actually more of a, I don't know, XY, ZY plane. And then when you apply rotation to this, or longitude, it rotates that plane around the axis. But if you notice, the cover rotates faster than the plane moves. So that's one full rotation. And all of these orientations on this side are the same as the orientations on this side. Like, you couldn't tell looking at the basis vector whether it was one or the other. So there's basically, at 2 pi rotation, 360 degrees, then this graph extends and covers both directions, and is a continuous graph otherwise. Oops. If the longitude is exactly 0, I do get this one line that goes out and comes in on this side. Otherwise, they go normally around this direction. But the rate that it goes around the outside is lower and lower. Like, the angular change out here is much faster than angular change inside. So this is still the origin, where everything's up and normalized. And when I rotate this graph, they sort of counter-rotate themselves and maintain an equal trajectory in between them. Which, considering this is, you know, somewhat of an ideal magnetic dipole graph. But if these were sort of poles, then the angle of change in between one and the other, I think, would be represented in a graph somewhat like that. But these are rotation vectors, and everything's 90 degrees to what you're actually seeing for the actual outcome, and it's just a rotation. There's no linear offset in between these. So this is this covering map. And it's always a plane. Oops. In this particular orientation. So if you have a base offset, instead of well, let's find 0 again. So in this base offset, the graph starts as a plane and just kind of goes out to the edges and loops around. But then related twists do this transformation, which is kind of cool. I mean, there's a circle on the other side that gets formed. That's the other pole. When there's a slight deviation, the latitude isn't 0. What is that? That's a strange flip for 0. It's in between. Well, longitude and spin end up overlapping. I can't make Sure I can. So typically they don't actually penetrate through and match to the other side. I mean, under normal rotations, the flip is entirely contained within the rotation coordinate system. Um, but if this is offset, say half pi, I don't know, 1 pi is more interesting. But really, latitude and longitude kind of overlap there. Um, so I don't know. That's this program.